Chapter 30. Then Hezekiah invited all of Israel and Judah, with personal letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, to come to the temple of God in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover to Israel's God. The king and his officials in the congregation in Jerusalem had decided to celebrate Passover in the second month. They hadn't been able to celebrate it at the regular time because not enough of the priests were yet personally prepared, and the people hadn't had time to gather in Jerusalem. Under these circumstances, the revised date was approved by both king and people, and they sent out the invitation from one end of the country to the other, from Beersheba in the south to Dan in the north. Come and celebrate the Passover to Israel's God in Jerusalem. No one living had ever celebrated it properly. The king gave the orders, and the couriers delivered the invitations from the king and his leaders throughout Israel and Judah. The invitation read, "O Israelites, come back to God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, so that he can return to you who have survived the predations of the king of Assyria. Don't repeat the sins of your ancestors who turned their backs on God, the God of their ancestors, who then brought them to ruin. You can see the ruins all around you. Don't be pig-headed as your ancestors were. Clasp God's outstretched hand. Come to his temple of holy worship, consecrated for all time. Serve God, your God. You'll no longer be in danger of his hot anger. If you come back to God, your captive relatives and children will be treated compassionately and allowed to come home. Your God is gracious and kind and won't snub you. Come back, and he'll welcome you with open arms." So the couriers set out, going from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, as far north as Zebulun. But the people poked fun at them, treated them as a joke. But not all. Some from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun weren't too proud to accept the invitation and come to Jerusalem. It was better in Judah. God worked powerfully among them to make it unanimous, responding to the orders sent out by the king and his officials, orders backed up by the word of God. It turned out that there was a tremendous crowd of people when the time came in the second month to celebrate the Passover, sometimes called the Feast of Unraised Bread. First, they went to work and got rid of all the pagan altars that were in Jerusalem, hauled them off and dumped them in the Kidron Valley. Then, on the 14th day of the second month, they slaughtered the Passover lambs. The priests and Levites weren't ready, but now, embarrassed in their laziness, they consecrated themselves and brought whole burnt offerings to the temple of God. Ready now, they stood at their posts as designated by the revelation of Moses, the holy man. The priests sprinkled the blood the Levites handed to them. Because so many in the congregation had not properly prepared themselves by consecration and so were not qualified, the Levites took charge of the slaughter of the Passover lambs so that they would be properly consecrated to God. There were a lot of people, especially those from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, who did not eat the Passover meal because they had not prepared themselves adequately. Hezekiah prayed for these as follows: "May God, who is all good, pardon and forgive everyone who sincerely desires God, the God of our ancestors, even, especially, these who do not meet the literal conditions stated for access to the temple." God responded to Hezekiah's prayer and healed the people. All the Israelites present in Jerusalem celebrated the Passover, Feast of Unraised Bread, for 7 days, celebrated exuberantly. The Levites and priests praised God day after day, filling the air with praise sounds of percussion and brass. Hezekiah commended the Levites for the superb way in which they had led the people in the worship of God. When the feast and festival, that glorious 7 days of worship, the making of offerings, and the praising of God, the God of their ancestors, were over, the tables cleared and the floors swept, they all decided to keep going for another 7 days. So they just kept on celebrating, and as joyfully as they began. Hezekiah, king of Judah, gave 1,000 bulls and 7,000 sheep for the congregation's worship. The officials gave an additional 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep. And there turned out to be plenty of consecrated priests, qualified and well prepared. The whole congregation of Judah, the priests and Levites, the congregation that came in from Israel, and the resident aliens from both Israel and Judah were all in on the joyous celebration. Jerusalem was bursting with joy. Nothing like this had taken place in Jerusalem since Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, had built and dedicated the temple. The priests and Levites had the last word. They stood and blessed the people. And God listened as the ascending sound of their prayers entered his holy heaven. Chapter 31. After the Passover celebration, they all took off for the cities of Judah and smashed the phallic stone monuments, chopped down the sacred Asherah groves, and demolished the neighborhood's sex and religion shrines and local god shops. They didn't stop until they had been all through Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Then they all went back home and resumed their everyday lives. Hezekiah organized the groups of priests and Levites for their respective tasks, handing out job descriptions for conducting the services of worship, making the various offerings, and making sure that thanks and praise took place wherever and whenever God was worshipped. He also designated his personal contribution for the whole burnt offerings for the morning and evening worship, for Sabbaths, for new moon festivals, and for the special worship days set down in the revelation of God. In addition, he asked the people who lived in Jerusalem to be responsible for providing for the priests and Levites so they, without distraction or concern, could give themselves totally to the revelation of God. As soon as Hezekiah's orders had gone out, the Israelites responded generously. First fruits of the grain harvest, new wine, oil, honey, everything they grew. They didn't hold back, turning over a tithe of everything. They also brought in a tithe of their cattle, sheep, and anything else they owned that had been dedicated to God. Everything was sorted and piled in mounds. They started doing this in the 3rd month and didn't finish until the 7th month. When Hezekiah and his leaders came and saw the extent of the mounds of gifts, they praised God and commended God's people, Israel. Hezekiah then consulted the priests and Levites on how to handle the abundance of offerings. Azariah, chief priest of the family of Zadok, answered, "From the moment of this huge outpouring of gifts to the temple of God, there has been plenty to eat for everyone with food left over. God has blessed his people. Just look at the evidence." Hezekiah then ordered storerooms to be prepared in the temple of God. When they were ready, they brought in all the offerings of tithes and sacred gifts. They put Conaniah the Levite in charge with his brother Shimei as assistant. Jehiel, Azaziah, Nahath, Asahel, Jeremoth, Jozabad, Eliel, Ismachiah, Mahath, and Benaiah were project managers under the direction of Conaniah and Shimei, carrying out the orders of King Hezekiah and Azariah the chief priest of the temple of God. Kor, son of Imnah the Levite, security guard of the east gate, was in charge of the freewill offerings of God and responsible for distributing the offerings and sacred gifts. Faithful support out in the priestly cities was provided by Eden, Miniamin, Jeshua, Shemaiah, Amariah, and Shechaniah. They were even-handed in their distributions to their co-workers, all males 30 years and older, in each of their respective divisions as they entered the temple of God each day to do their assigned work. Their work was all organized by divisions. The divisions comprised officially registered priests by family and Levites 20 years and older by job description. The official family tree included everyone in the entire congregation, their small children, wives, sons, and daughters. The ardent dedication they showed in bringing themselves and their gifts to worship was total. No one was left out. The Aaronites, the priests who lived out on the pastures that belonged to the priest cities, had reputable men on hand to distribute regular rations to every priest, everyone listed in the official family tree of the Levites. Hezekiah carried out this work and kept it up everywhere in Judah. He was the very best, good, right, and true before his God. Everything he took up, whether it had to do with worship in God's temple or the carrying out of God's law and commandments, he did well in a spirit of prayerful worship. He was a great success. Chapter 32. And then, after this exemplary track record, this: Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and attacked Judah. He put the fortified cities under siege, determined to take them. When Hezekiah realized that Sennacherib's strategy was to take Jerusalem, he talked to his advisors and military leaders about eliminating all the water supplies outside the city. They thought it was a good idea. There was a great turnout of people to plug the springs and tear down the aqueduct. They said, "Why should the kings of Assyria march in and be furnished with running water?" Hezekiah also went to work repairing every part of the city wall that was damaged, built defensive towers on it, built another wall of defense further out, and reinforced the defensive rampart, the Millo, of the old city of David. He also built up a large store of armaments, spears and shields. He then appointed military officers to be responsible for the people and got them all together at the public square in front of the city gate. Hezekiah rallied the people, saying, "Be strong, take courage, don't be intimidated by the king of Assyria and his troops. There are more men on our side than on their side. He only has a bunch of mere men. We have our God to help us and fight us." Morale surged. Hezekiah's words put steel in their spines. Later on, Sennacherib, who had set up camp a few miles away at Lachish, sent messengers to Jerusalem, addressing Judah through Hezekiah. A proclamation of Sennacherib, king of Assyria. "You poor people, do you think you're safe in that so-called fortress of Jerusalem? You're sitting ducks. Do you think Hezekiah will save you? Don't be stupid. Hezekiah has fed you a pack of lies. When he says, 'God will save us from the power of the king of Assyria,' he's lying. You're all going to end up dead. Wasn't it Hezekiah who cleared out all the neighborhood worship shrines and told you there's only one legitimate place to worship? Do you have any idea what I and my ancestors have done to all the countries around here? Has there been a single God anywhere strong enough to stand up against me? Can you name one God among all the nations that either I or my ancestors have ravaged that so much as lifted a finger against me? So what makes you think you'll make out any better with your God? Don't let Hezekiah fool you. Don't let him get by with his barefaced lies. Don't trust him. No God of any country or kingdom ever has been one bit of help against me or my ancestors. What kind of odds does that give your God?" The messengers felt free to throw in their personal comments, putting down both God and God's servant Hezekiah. Sennacherib continued to send letters insulting the God of Israel. The gods of the nations were powerless to help their people. The God of Hezekiah is no better, probably worse. The messengers would come up to the wall of Jerusalem and shout up to the people standing on the wall, shouting their propaganda in Hebrew, trying to scare them into demoralized submission. They contemptuously lumped the God of Jerusalem in with the handmade gods of other peoples. King Hezekiah, joined by the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, responded by praying, calling up to heaven. God answered by sending an angel who wiped out everyone in the Assyrian camp, both warriors and officers. Sennacherib was forced to return home in disgrace, tail between his legs. When he went into the temple of his God, his own sons killed him. God saved Hezekiah and the citizens of Jerusalem from Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and everyone else. And he continued to take good care of them. People streamed into Jerusalem, bringing offerings for the worship of God and expensive presents to Hezekiah, king of Judah. All the surrounding nations were impressed. Hezekiah's stock soared. Sometime later, Hezekiah became deathly sick. He prayed to God and was given a reassuring sign. But the sign, instead of making Hezekiah grateful, made him arrogant. This made God angry, and his anger spilled over on Judah and Jerusalem. But then Hezekiah, and Jerusalem with him, repented of his arrogance, and God withdrew his anger while Hezekiah lived. Hezekiah ended up very wealthy and much honored. He built treasuries for all his silver, gold, precious stones, spices, shields, and valuables, barns for the grain, new wine and olive oil, stalls for his various breeds of cattle, and pens for his flocks. He founded royal cities for himself and built up huge stocks of sheep and cattle. God saw to it that he was extravagantly rich. Hezekiah was also responsible for diverting the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and rerouting the water to the west side of the city of David. Hezekiah succeeded in everything he did. But when the rulers of Babylon sent emissaries to find out about the sign from God that had taken place earlier, God left him on his own to see what he would do. He wanted to test his heart. The rest of the history of Hezekiah and his life of loyal service you can read for yourself. It's written in the visions of the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, in the royal annals of the kings of Judah and Israel. When Hezekiah died, they buried him in the upper part of the King David cemetery. Everyone in Judah and Jerusalem came to the funeral. He was buried in great honor. Manasseh, his son, was the next king.